I was 19 when my father told me, in the calm, clinical voice he used for delivering bad diagnoses, that if I refused to apply to medical school, I should stop calling myself part of his family. He wasn't being dramatic, and that was somehow the worst part of it. There was no shouting, no dramatic gesture, just a quiet, measured certainty that made the whole thing feel less like an argument and more like a verdict already reached long before I'd said a word. In our house, that was simply how things worked. Decisions were made with the same detachment my father used when explaining a prognosis to a worried patient, and disagreement was treated less like a difference of opinion and more like a diagnosis of its own, something to be corrected. My father was a cardiologist, my mother a neurologist, my older sister Priya already halfway through her residency by the time I graduated high school, and every single conversation at our dinner table for as long as I could remember had orbited around rounds, residencies, and which specialty carried the most prestige. Even our vacations had a way of circling back to medicine, my father striking up conversations with any doctor we happened to encounter, whether at a resort pool or a museum gift shop, my mother quizzing Priya on differential diagnoses over breakfast like it was a fun family game rather than an early apprenticeship. I grew up assuming, the way you assume the sky is blue, that I would eventually join them, that the white coat waiting for me in some imagined future was simply a fact of my life, rather than a choice anyone expected me to actually make. The shift started slowly, almost without my noticing it at first. I'd always been the quieter one at family gatherings, more interested in the paintings hanging in whatever restaurant we were eating at than the conversation happening around me, more likely to wander off during museum visits and get absorbed in a single canvas while everyone else moved briskly through the gallery checking items off some mental itinerary. My parents found this endearing when I was younger, a charming quirk in an otherwise predictable family, the artistic streak that would presumably be outgrown once real life and real responsibilities set in. Everything changed during a high school trip to a museum conservation lab, a field trip organized almost as an afterthought by my art teacher, something most of my classmates treated as an easy day out of regular classes. I remember standing behind a glass partition, watching a woman in magnifying glasses carefully clean 400 years of accumulated grime and old varnish off a portrait with a cotton swab and impossible, almost meditative patience, and feeling something click into place inside me that I hadn't felt during any of the countless hours I'd spent trailing after my parents through hospital hallways or listening to Priya recite anatomy terms at dinner. The conservator explained, in a voice full of genuine reverence, how she was uncovering details the artist had painted centuries earlier, colors and brushstrokes hidden under layers of yellowed varnish, essentially resurrecting something that had been slowly disappearing without anyone noticing. I went home that night and couldn't stop thinking about it. I started researching art conservation programs in secret, reading everything I could find about the field, staying up late watching documentary footage of conservators working on damaged masterpieces, feeling a pull toward this work that I'd never felt toward anything medicine-related, despite years spent absorbing the assumption that medicine was simply what our family did. Over the following 2 years, that secret research turned into secret applications, portfolios assembled quietly on evenings when my parents assumed I was studying for the standardized tests that would eventually get me into a pre-med program somewhere respectable. I applied to 2 programs my senior year, both strong conservation programs attached to respected art schools, and got into both, acceptance letters that I hid in my desk drawer for nearly 3 weeks before working up the courage to tell anyone. I know how it sounds, weighing art restoration against cardiology, weighing 400 years of oil paint against actual human hearts, but the pull I felt toward one and the complete absence of pull I felt toward the other made the choice feel less like a decision and more like something I'd simply discovered about myself, undeniable once I'd seen it clearly. I made the mistake, in hindsight, of announcing my decision at Sunday dinner instead of finding some gentler way to break it to them individually, some careful sequence of conversations that might have softened the blow. But our family didn't really do private conversations about important things. Important things got discussed at that table, in front of everyone, almost like a small tribunal, and some part of me, the part that had spent months building up courage in secret, wanted to just get it over with rather than draw out the anxiety any longer. I remember the exact moment. My mother had made her usual Sunday roast, Priya was home for the weekend between rotations, and I waited until we'd all settled into the meal before saying it plainly, without much preamble, because I'd rehearsed it so many times in my head that the words came out almost mechanically. I got into 2 art conservation programs. I've decided I'm going to study art restoration instead of pre-med. The table went quiet in a way I'd never experienced before, not the comfortable quiet of a family simply eating, but a taut, charged silence, the kind that precedes something breaking. My father set down his fork very deliberately, placing it exactly parallel to his knife, a small, precise gesture that somehow conveyed more disapproval than any raised voice could have. Every person in this family has practiced medicine for 3 generations, he said, his voice level, almost gentle, which made it worse. You understand what you're throwing away. I'm not throwing anything away. I'm choosing something else. There is no something else in this family. He said it so simply, so certain, like he was stating a fact about gravity rather than an opinion about my life, and I remember feeling something cold settle into my stomach at how absolute the sentence sounded, how it left no room for negotiation or discussion, just a closed door dressed up as a statement of fact. My mother didn't argue with him, didn't soften it, didn't offer any counterbalance to what he'd said. She just sat there with her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes moving between my father and me like she was watching a verdict get delivered in a courtroom rather than participating in a family conversation. I kept waiting for her to say something, anything, some small crack in the unified front, but it never came. And Priya, 23 and already deep in the culture of the family she'd fully absorbed by then, 3 years into internalizing everything our parents valued, wouldn't meet my eyes at all, staring instead at her plate as though the roast chicken required her full concentration. I tried, for a while longer that evening, to explain myself further, to describe what I'd felt standing behind that glass partition watching centuries of hidden color slowly emerge, to make them understand that this wasn't rebellion for its own sake, but something I genuinely found myself drawn to, something that felt as real and legitimate to me as medicine clearly felt to them. None of it landed. My father's expression didn't shift, my mother's silence didn't break, and by the end of dinner, plates barely touched, the conversation had ended not with resolution but with an unspoken agreement that nothing further would be discussed that night, an agreement enforced entirely through the particular quality of silence my family excelled at generating whenever something had gone too far to easily fix. I went to bed that night with a distinct, sinking feeling that something fundamental had shifted in our house, something that wouldn't simply smooth itself over with time the way ordinary disagreements usually did. I moved out 3 weeks later with 2 suitcases and the acceptance letter to a program 4 states away, the decision made easier, in a strange way, by how thoroughly the silence had settled over our house in the days following that dinner. My father didn't call to say goodbye, didn't offer to help me load the small U-Haul trailer I'd rented, didn't do any of the things I'd half hoped he might do even after everything, some last-minute gesture that would prove the closed door wasn't fully closed. My mother sent one text the morning I left. "This is your choice, not ours." 7 words that I read probably 50 times over the following months, trying to extract some hidden warmth from them that probably was never actually there, trying to convince myself it meant something other than exactly what it said. Priya reached out exactly twice in the first year, brief, guarded messages that felt more like formalities than actual attempts to stay connected. The first came about 2 months after I'd left, a short text asking how my classes were going, which I answered enthusiastically, maybe too enthusiastically, sending back paragraphs about my first restoration project, a small 19th century landscape, painting I'd been assigned to clean and stabilize under close supervision. She responded with a single word, "Cool," and nothing further for weeks. The second message came around the holidays, asking if I was coming home for Christmas, and when I said I wasn't sure I'd even be welcome, she didn't push back or reassure me, just said, "Okay, let me know," and that was the last real conversation we had for years. I built an entire life without them during those early years, though building isn't quite the right word for how difficult and uncertain it felt at the time, more like scrambling to construct something stable out of materials I hadn't chosen and hadn't been prepared for. My first apartment near campus was a converted attic space with slanted ceilings so low I could only stand upright in the center of the room, heated by a single radiator that clanked ominously through the night and never quite drove out the cold during that first brutal winter. I worked two part-time jobs alongside my coursework. One shelving books at the university library, another waiting tables at a diner near campus that stayed open late for the graduate students who never seemed to sleep because my parents' considerable financial support, the kind that had always been assumed and available for anything medicine-related, simply evaporated the moment I chose differently. There were nights in that freezing studio apartment during my first year in the program when I cried myself to sleep wondering if I'd made some irreversible mistake, wondering if the version of myself who'd stood so certain behind that glass partition years earlier had been naive, had underestimated exactly how much I was giving up for something that felt meaningful, but offered none of the security or approval I'd grown up assuming would always be there. I remember one night in particular, maybe 4 months into that first year, when an upstairs pipe burst and flooded part of my ceiling, and I sat on the floor of my ruined little apartment at 2 a.m, water pooling around textbooks I couldn't afford to replace, and allowed myself, just that once, to fully consider calling my father, apologizing, telling him I'd reconsider medical school if it meant this loneliness would end. I didn't make that call. I don't fully know why, except that some stubborn, quiet part of me recognized that reversing course wouldn't actually fix what had broken between us, that the problem was never really about the specific career I'd chosen, but about what my choosing anything outside their expectations had revealed about how conditional their love had apparently been all along. Calling to apologize for choosing art restoration wouldn't undo that revelation. It would just mean abandoning the one thing I'd found that felt entirely, undeniably mine, in exchange for a version of belonging that had never actually included room for who I really was. So I stayed. I mopped up the water, salvaged what books I could, and went to class the next morning on almost no sleep, and somewhere in the accumulation of nights like that one, something in me started to toughen in a way I hadn't expected, a kind of resilience I wouldn't have developed if my family had simply supported me through an easier path. Somewhere around year 3, restoring a water-damaged 19th century portrait for a small regional museum as part of an advanced practicum, I stopped wondering whether I'd made a mistake. The painting had come to us in rough condition, a portrait of an unnamed woman that had spent decades in a damp storage facility before the museum acquired it, its surface clouded with mold damage and flaking paint that required weeks of careful, methodical work to stabilize before any actual restoration could even begin. I spent nearly 4 months on that single painting, learning its damage inch by inch, consulting with senior conservators about technique, slowly bringing back details of the woman's face and the fabric of her dress that had been essentially invisible when the piece first arrived. The day we unveiled the finished restoration for the museum's Small Collections Committee, watching people who had never seen the painting in anything but its damaged state react with genuine astonishment at what had been recovered, I felt something settle permanently inside me, a certainty that replaced whatever doubt had lingered from those earlier, harder months. I'd found the thing I was supposed to be doing, and it had nothing to do with a stethoscope, nothing to do with rounds or residencies or the particular kind of prestige my family had spent generations accumulating. It was its own kind of meaningful work, quieter and slower than medicine, but no less real for being different. I built a career from there, slowly and deliberately, taking on progressively more responsibility at the regional museum before eventually striking out to complete my own advanced training and certification, developing a reputation within a fairly small, specialized field for careful, patient work on textile and oil paintings alike. I built friendships, too, a chosen family of fellow conservators and museum colleagues who understood exactly why someone might dedicate their entire career to painstakingly restoring a single damaged canvas, people who never once made me feel like I'd settled for something lesser than what I could have been. 9 years passed this way, each one carrying me further from that dinner table and the silence that had followed it, further into a life entirely of my own making, 3,000 miles from the assumptions I'd grown up inside. I thought about my family less over time, not because the wound had fully healed, but because the life I'd built had genuinely filled a space where they used to be, occupying it so thoroughly that I sometimes went months without consciously thinking about my father's precise, deliberate placement of his fork that night, or my mother's 7-word text, or the particular way Priya had avoided my eyes at that final family dinner. And then, 9 years almost exactly to the week since I'd loaded that U-Haul trailer and driven away, my mother's assistant emailed me a wedding invitation, formal and slightly impersonal, addressed to me by my full name as though I were any other distant relative rather than her second daughter, informing me that my sister Priya was getting married in 6 weeks, and that my presence, should I choose to attend, would be welcomed. Priya was getting married, and despite everything, despite 9 years of near total silence, I was invited. I sat with that invitation for 3 days before deciding to go, turning it over in my hands more times than I could count, reading and rereading the formal wording, as if some hidden message might reveal itself between the elegant calligraphy and the RSVP card. I told myself I was doing it for her, not for the rest of them, that whatever had happened between me and our parents had nothing to do with whatever relationship Priya and I might still salvage if I showed up, though even as I told myself that story, some quieter part of me knew it wasn't the whole truth. 9 years of distance hadn't erased the fact that these were still my parents, still the people who had shaped nearly 2 decades of my life before that final dinner, and some part of me, however guarded, wanted to see them again too. I called my closest friend from the conservation program, a woman named Elena who'd become something like a sister to me over the years, someone who'd heard the entire story in fragments over late nights in our shared studio space, and asked her what she thought I should do. She didn't tell me what to decide, just asked me a single question that stuck with me for the rest of that week. If you don't go, will you regret it more than if you do? I didn't have an immediate answer, but by the 3rd night of turning the invitation over in my hands, I knew what the honest answer was. I flew in the morning of the wedding, choosing a flight that would land with just enough time to check into a hotel and change before the ceremony, deliberately avoiding any earlier arrival that might have invited pressure to stay with family or spend extended time with my parents before the buffer of a crowded event could soften the reintroduction. I checked into a hotel instead of staying with anyone, a small, practical decision that felt important at the time, a way of maintaining some control over a day that already felt entirely out of my hands in every other respect. Arriving at the venue felt like walking into a stranger's life rather than my own family's celebration. The venue itself, an elegant hotel ballroom overlooking a manicured garden, was clearly the kind of place my parents would have chosen, tasteful and expensive without being ostentatious, everything precisely coordinated down to the floral arrangements. The ballroom was full of people I recognized immediately and people I'd never met, colleagues from my parents' hospital mixed in with relatives I hadn't seen since childhood, aunts and uncles who I could see doing quick mental math when they spotted me, trying to place exactly how many years it had been and whether they should mention it. Everyone was dressed the way our family always dressed for events like this, expensively, purposefully, like even a wedding was a professional appearance, a networking opportunity dressed up in silk and tailored suits. I spotted my father first, silver-haired now in a way that genuinely surprised me. The passage of 9 years suddenly made concrete in his face in a way it hadn't been in my imagination of him. He still carried himself with that same unmistakable certainty though, shoulders square, chin level, deep in conversation with a man I vaguely recognized as the chief of surgery at his hospital, someone who'd attended a handful of family gatherings back when I was still a teenager living under that roof. My father glanced up as I passed, and something flickered across his face. Recognition, maybe surprise, maybe something more complicated that I couldn't quite name from a distance. But he didn't approach me, and I didn't approach him. 9 years apparently hadn't produced enough momentum in either of us to close that distance first, and I felt a familiar tightness settle into my chest, the specific ache of standing so close to someone who used to be the center of your world, and finding neither of you quite sure how to bridge the gap. I found my mother near the head table, adjusting a place card with the same meticulous attention to detail I remembered from every event she'd ever organized, and this time there was no avoiding it. She saw me, and I watched her face cycle through several expressions in the span of about 2 seconds. Shock, something that looked almost like relief, quickly followed by something that looked almost like fear, and then, unmistakably, a kind of practiced composure sliding back into place, the same composure I remembered from every difficult conversation of my childhood, the professional mask she wore for delivering difficult diagnoses. "You came," she said, and I couldn't tell if it was a question or simply an observation, her voice catching slightly in a way that surprised me, a small crack in the composure she'd otherwise managed to maintain. Priya invited me. I wasn't going to miss her wedding. She looked at me for a long moment, taking in whatever 9 years had changed about my face, my posture, the way I carried myself now compared to the 19-year-old who'd left with 2 suitcases and an acceptance letter clutched against her chest like armor. I could see her cataloging the differences, the way I stood a little straighter now, the confidence that had grown into me slowly over nearly a decade of building something entirely on my own terms. "You look well," she finally said, which felt like the safest possible thing she could have offered, a comment about my appearance instead of anything that touched the actual distance between us, the kind of small talk you'd offer a colleague rather than the daughter you'd effectively let walk away. "I am well," I said, and I meant it fully, without any bitterness attached to the statement, just simple fact. "I have a good life." Something in her expression tightened slightly at that, like she'd been braced for me to say something harder, something accusatory, some version of the anger she probably assumed I'd been carrying for 9 years, and my simple statement of fact had somehow landed with more weight than an argument would have. It was, I think, the last thing she expected to hear, that I hadn't spent the better part of a decade nursing resentment, that I'd actually built something worth being proud of rather than merely surviving out of spite. "What exactly is it you do now?" she asked, her voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity now, something that felt less rehearsed than her earlier comment. Priya mentioned something about art, but I confess I never fully understood the specifics. "Art restoration. I work primarily with oil paintings, some textile pieces. I run my own studio now, actually took on 2 junior conservators last year." I said it plainly, without either apology or excessive pride, just laying out the facts of my life the way I might describe it to anyone else, though I was watching her face closely as I spoke, curious how she'd receive the information. She nodded slowly, processing this, and I could see her trying to fit it into whatever framework she'd built for me in my absence, whatever story she'd told herself and everyone else about the daughter who'd walked away from medicine. That sounds like meaningful work," she said, and I believed, for the first time in longer than I could remember, that she actually meant it, that the words weren't just polite filler, but something closer to genuine acknowledgement. We stood there together in a silence that wasn't quite comfortable but wasn't hostile either, both of us aware of 9 years compressed into the space between 2 people at a wedding, neither of us quite sure how to bridge it in the middle of a crowded ballroom with a string quartet warming up nearby, guests filtering past us toward their assigned seats, oblivious to the small, quiet reckoning happening near the head table. The ceremony itself was beautiful, and I cried more than I expected to, watching Priya walk down the aisle toward a kind, quiet man named David who I'd met only that morning but who looked at my sister like she'd invented the concept of joy. I hadn't been part of her life for most of the last decade, hadn't known about David until the wedding invitation itself arrived with his name printed beside hers, hadn't been there for their first date or his proposal, or any of the small, accumulating moments that build a relationship worth marrying into. Sitting in that pew, I felt the specific grief of having missed so much, alongside something unexpectedly close to peace, because at least I was here now, at least this door hadn't closed entirely, at least I'd get to know the man my sister had chosen, even if I'd missed everything that led up to this particular afternoon. At the reception, my mother found me again, this time pulling me toward a quieter corner near the bar, away from the noise of the dance floor where guests had already started gathering despite the early hour. She had a glass of wine in her hand, and something in her posture had loosened slightly, the composure from earlier softened by champagne and the emotional weight of watching her older daughter marry, of having both her children under the same roof for the first time in nearly a decade. "I want to say something," she started, and I braced myself, unsure whether I was about to receive an apology or another version of the same certainty that had ended our relationship 9 years earlier. I was wrong. I hadn't expected those exact words, not from her, not ever, and I stood there for a moment just absorbing them, letting them settle into a space I'd stopped expecting anyone in my family to fill.